So, welcome to another episode of Visionary, How William Blake Changed the World. And it gives me immense pleasure this week to introduce Mark Vernon, a writer and psychotherapist who has a background in physics but also theology with a PhD on Plato. He's a former Church of England priest who lives in South England. And I'm talking to Mark about his new book, Awake, William Blake and the Power of the Imagination. So Mark, you and I we've kind of crossed paths in various formats, but it's the first opportunity I've actually had to speak to you directly about your work. So first of all, congratulations on the book, which has just come out in the UK, and I understand is going to be published in the US in September. Could you
Yeah,
tell me a
that's
little
all
bit,
right.
tell me a
Yeah,
little bit
look,
about the book and what you're intending to do with that?
yeah, look. Well, thanks, Jason. It's a joy to join you. I mean, the work which you do and put out, particularly on YouTube, is a kind of nice virtual interlocutor when you're thinking about Blake and trying to find your way into Blake and your sense of how Blake's speaking to you. And I know that we share a love of Blake, but also have shared differences as well. So no doubt that will come out. But it's the sort of spirit with which the Blake penumbra,
Yeah.
that draws us both. And my book is taking a stand on where I think Blake speaks to us and why, in certain respects. But it is supposed to be for a general audience, someone that has heard a phrase like to see a world in a grain of sand. Sense and tastes there's something really important in that, but wants to know more and how they can take a deeper dive into Blake's imagery and poetry, which it's a funny old combo. I mean, you've been wrestling this forever, but how at once something sparks as clear as the daylight, but then even the next line takes you into something very obscure that you wonder on what on earth is going on. So it's to try and help people to find Blake as a friend who, once you've kind of opened the door a little bit, starts to give more and more and more, so becomes a friend for life.
Before turning to some of the topics in the book, just some general stuff which I know you've spoken about on your own channel a bit, but I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you got into Blake, particularly as a former clergyman as well, which again we found that there's some shared interest in this, which I don't think we were both anticipating.
I mean, that is very much part of the story, actually. I mean, at one level, I live in South London, as you're saying, and so Blake is our local mystic. I live in Camberwell. He talks about the lovely hills of Camberwell. It was still green, not covered in housing as it is now, but not that far from Lambeth, where of course he and Catherine lived for a decade. And so I'm very interested in what you might call this mystical side of Christianity or religion in general. And immediately one uses the word mystical cautiously in a Blake circle because of Northrop Frye's famous remark that he's a visionary, not a mystic. But that sort of sense that somehow the inner vitality of whatever religion, whatever else it holds, is the kind of heart of it. And so trying to relate to that has been very much part of my recovery from the time since I left the church. I could never quite call myself an atheist. I had a sort of phase trying to be an agnostic. I did this work on Plato, which kind of opened up a worldview again that was more than material. And so Blake has been very much someone who I would say now, speaks to me, draws me into a wider worldview, challenges me, but always with a sense, this famous image of the golden string he has. I do feel, can I take another turn of the golden string as I wind it into a ball and see where it might be leading? So it is very personal, the sense of engaging with Blake. What can he help me see? But also, I think that I very much bought into this idea, which I think is quite widespread now amongst historians of the Georgian period, that in that time, a couple of hundred years ago, were being laid down the assumptions which we still carry when we relate to the world in very large part. And, our mentality, our sense of how we relate to each other, to the natural world, to God or the gods. And Blake, I think, captures that wider spirit as well as the personal soulfulness. And so this is why I think he's a prophet of our times as well as can speak to people, because he understands the deep currents, which 200 years later, it's not hard to think in many respects at least, are sort of going horribly wrong. For all the great things about living in the 21st century as well. That's part of the complication there. But even that, the contraries of our times, Blake can speak to as well. So he's not. He opens up all sorts of um, aids with living in the modern world, put it like that. So that's very much part of it, as well as the personal journey.
I just want to come back to something you mentioned, use that almost at the beginning, and it's happened so often, that kind of almost apologetic use of the word mystic. And Northrop Frye has so much to add. I love Northrop Frye. I remember in 2007, so the anniversary of Blake's birth, the 250th anniversary, and there was a big conference, and at the end of it, there was a discussion amongst, about 100 or more of the world's leading Blake scholars about who was the most influential Blake scholar. And without question, it was Northrop Frye. Northrop Frye shaped 20th century Blake studies, but he made mistakes. And I mean, I've been kind of under that assumption for about 20, 25 years that, Blake was a visionary, not a mystic. And he was actually giving a talk in Bradford at the Bradford Literature Festival, I think 2016. Um, and I was sort of like, myself and another academic, Michael Phillips, on one stage, because, Blake's not a mystic, because the great Northrop Frye says so. And the entire audience was kind of like, what? And it was actually, it was one of those really interesting moments where you realize, oh, yeah, certain things you're just operating in this academic bubble. In this case, one literally formed by Northrop Frye. Um, and it's something I think we'll come back onto this later on, where I frequently have disagreements with people, and they're sort of like, yes, but you say this. I go, yeah, I know, because I'm struggling with this. I don't actually know. There was a great comment, and it's going to lead on something that's in your book, and I want to draw attention in a moment, but a great comment you made earlier to me when we're talking sort of privately, just that you know, one of the things with like, one moment you'll be reading something and it's incredibly lucid. This is the most obvious thing has ever been written in the world. And you turn the page and go, okay, I literally have no idea what is happening in this page. And that is, for anybody who loves Blake, that is always part of the lifelong struggle that comes of making sense of Blake, actually.
I mean, maybe just to leap in that, I think
Yeah.
although I very much resisted my book psychologizing Blake,
Yeah.
partly because I think modern psychology is in quite a state, again, for all the good things that it brings. And so going back to a time before there was psychology, but there was still a deep, deep wisdom about inner life, which I
Yes.
think Blake offers too, is really helpful. But I do also, part of the resistance to psychologizing Blake is not is to help to help read him actually, because I think that one of the things he does do is that he writes a bit like we think or imagine, a bit like what's going on inside us, and maybe even what's going on inside a culture. And that's been very helpful. And so, every so often we have moments of clarity, but then we go into a sort of jumble. And it may literally be because we've turned the corner of a street and are suddenly in a different place. So places too carry this sort of inner confusion as well as moments of clarity. But what I love about Blake is that it's a bit like, if you sit with someone in psychotherapy, and they have a dream and they're not sure what it means,
Yeah.
and it just seems really weird or strange. But when people realize that it's come from their psyche still, it's something to do with them. It may be relatively trivial, it may be more profound. And so it's really helped me engaging with the more complicated bits of Blake to think of it a bit in that way, but without just psychologizing it. I mean, there's one person you won't see reference in the book, and that's the wonderful Carl Jung. Because the trouble with Carl Jung is that he's another one of these great figures that the minute you say the word archetype or something, you're really already lost to Jung's world. And and I want to try and keep in the Blake world as much as possible.
And talk about keeping in the Blake world. I wanted to start off, so turning to Awake. I want to start off with a decision you made, and actually, it's a question of stylistics. So it's one that I found very interesting reading your book, and that's not using quote marks. You've indicated this use of italics rather than quote marks. I think you said a book about Meister Eckhart, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I hope it works. I mean, it worked for me in this book about Meister Eckhart called Dangerous Mystic. that is it's Joel, I forget his surname, I'm afraid right now, but it's a wonderful book about Eckhart that is at once a historical situating of Eckhart, but is quotes lots of Eckhart using italics,
Yeah.
and then also is as interested in the content of Eckhart as well as just understanding how it relates to other thinkers and all that reception history as well. It really helped me when I was reading this book on Eckhart to return to Eckhart's writings because I felt that I was almost listening to two voices in the book on him. And so I hope that in some measure, trying that device in my book helps people then to return to, the direct voice, not just the voice in conversation with someone else's,
It
because
was
it is, I really want people to fall in love again with Blake. That's the key object.
what was interesting to me is that because most of the writing I do on Blake, so certainly books, papers, etc., is academically driven rather than automatically for a general public. So there's always a sense of me when I'm writing in which I am very self-consciously bracketing off, historically engaged with Blake operating in certain cultural materialist factors, etc., etc. Um, Less so actually when I'm doing podcasts or blogs or blog post stuff like that. So I suppose that's where I get into the more intimate relation. But I just say I found it incredibly interesting, and it did create the sense of intimacy of engaging with your ideas and those with Blake as well. And actually, I mean, I was going to pick out some key themes just for us to start following. I suspect our conversation though will just follow its own path, follow its own golden string. But an obvious one, which actually I've also engaged with a lot over the years, is this notion of Blake as a prophet for the modern age, Blake as a means for actually helping us make sense of the world that we're living in. And again, if you wouldn't mind, just a little bit in terms of your own personal response to that. I'm really interested in why you feel that, rather than simply, this is what Blake's said, which is quite often how I approach the topic.
I mean, just to start with an observation of Blake's that I think is, very often present, if not always present in his work, is this idea that what now is was first imagined.
Yes.
And so the sense that our ancestors, if you like, were preparing the ground for the world in which we now live for centuries, maybe even longer. And the material capacity to make that world, say, particularly in relation to technology, that's probably the most obvious example, has now realized itself. But figures like Francis Bacon, very resonant figure in Blake, of course, he dreamed of a perfect machine that would iron out all the flaws in human thinking. And that's now how very much regard, I mean, I think it's deeply mistaken actually, but nonetheless regard artificial intelligence. And so, personally, I can feel in Blake those kind of deeper forces which are active and alive, in me because I'm part of this contemporary culture. And so that's part of the awakening he does. He's a figure that again, it's a bit like this, at first pass, it looks like Bacon, Newton, and Locke are these kind of like just figures of hate, and he's dividing them from Milton, Chaucer, and Shakespeare, But then you realize that actually, they're going to join hands in the vision of the divine presence, and when the spears of intellect are thrown down from the heavens and so on, and so you realize there's something more complicated going on. Or another very obvious example, the figure of Urizen. Urizen is not just a bad guy. And you partly realize this because Urizen isn't some tyrant just wielding over things, but is often like weeping and distressed at what's happening too. So it's that again, it immerses you in life in when you can feel in Blake how these contraries are often present at the same time in the minute particulars, the business of every day. I find that very helpful, very therapeutic, actually. And then, of course, he gives a kind of mythology to hold that. And I think stories and myths are really much underrated, actually, for all that we live, amidst 1,000 stories and myths. But they really can help us to live with the contraries of modern existence and not feel we have to decide and so therefore divide and fragment, which so much characterizes our society now. Because in one way we're all living in this large story together, and we can have different moments and different feelings without feeling that that's got to be, it needn't be a zero-sum game.
Yes.
And psychologically, that's very helpful in oneself because it means you don't split. But I think it's also very helpful, so, in terms of society now as well.
Actually, if you wouldn't mind, just knowing your background, particularly in psychotherapy, and that comment you made about Eurozone as well, but relating it to that final observation of yours, that stories and myths will help us not split. What's going on, in your opinion, then, with those fissures, that division of the Zoas in Blake?
Division in Blake is always a fall away from some kind of divine sense, but it's also the means by which the divine can be rediscovered, because division, even by being conscious of division, even when it's ruled by hatred, that division, there's also a desire to know, even to reconnect. I think love is prior to hate, if you like. You can only really hate that which you formerly felt connected to. Otherwise, it's just indifference. You don't care. So I think that relationship within this idea of division, that it is dividing, but it's also already intimates the possibility of reuniting in some way. And so I think that is, part, and that seeming paradox can be held in a story or a myth or a poem. And then, similarly with the figure of Satan and Eurism. I mean, I think actually one of the things that Blake's doing in relation to Milton is correcting one of Milton's mistakes, the genius that he was, which
Yes.
is to make, I mean, it's the famous remark about Paradise Lost that Satan's the most interesting character and so on. But in a wider context, I think that this idea which we have of Satan being this fiery, exciting kind of figure is one of the things that Blake's trying to correct when he describes, Satan being a kind of state and not an individual, and that it's an opaque, narrowed state. And I think he probably, if whether he gets this from Dante, it certainly resonates with Dante, because one of the big reveals in the Inferno is that on the floor of hell, Satan is frozen in this lake, almost at absolute zero, barely able to move. And I think that's a much truer, actually, way in which people related to the satanic and the devilish prior to the modern period, actually. That, I don't know, something like Satan with a goat's hooves, for example, now a staple of horror movies, supposed to freak you. Actually, I think originally was a way of mocking Satan,
Yes. Yes.
and that you'd be very wary of dark forces, but part of the wariness was also to mock, so that they kind of were kept in their place. Because, and theologically speaking, Satan and the other angels are fallen angels, which means that they used to belong to the light, but they've turned their back, thinking perhaps Euryzenically that they can possess and master the wisdom that properly belongs to the divine. And so there's a kind of compassion almost that you might feel for that. They've made this terrible mistake thinking that they can control it all. But, hands up, who hasn't done that at some time as well? So hence your remark about Satan sort of being us as well, and the Eurozenic being part of what can rule us too much if we're not careful.
Rather than get dragged into Satan, which was never my intention. But thank you very much. I mean, that Satan as a state, and actually the four zoas as different states that we will occupy or inhabit or move through. I think that fits into some of those elements really with in terms of the fundamental role of imagination. So actually, I've got two questions which are really easy to ask and nigh on impossible to answer, but they're very much taken up in your book. I'll start with the first one, which is obviously exercised Blakean scholars and anybody writing or engaging with Blake at all, and it's fundamental what you're doing. What's imagination? Why? What is it? What's the importance? What's the significance? It's easy to ask. I know to my cost, not so easy to answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the phrases, which again is easy to say, but then takes a whole lot to unpack, which I've used to try and as a sort of placeholder for what I'm trying to say about the imagination and what I think Blake is saying, but this is contested, is that, it's not that I have imagination or you have imagination or the artist has it even more so, but that imagination has us, and the invitation in this great sort of flow of imaginative activity is how we align with it or how we don't align with it. Do we resist it? So that's one of the, in a way, it's almost like a sort of point of divide, which I I do press really because I think that it's quite a fundamental issue. If if the imagination is a private possession, then we are, I think, left as individuals grappling to make sense of things. Whereas if the imagination can flow into us and we're porous to it, then I think we can give our lives to it, if you like. And I think this is partly what Blake talks about when he, prays, annihilate the selfhood in me, be thou all my life, and so on. How can he bring his no doubt genius, but to this wider source of revelation and vision and meaning and so on, and so that the world can be seen, in the fourfold way, not just in the Eurozenic or the single vision. So, and then the way that Blake unpacks that further, I think, is by linking the imagination to the figure of Jesus. And again, this is another point, of immediately obvious contention. But I think that Blake's actually quite an orthodox Christian in these kind of respects, that he realizes that whatever else the figure of Jesus is the Logos incarnate. And so, the Logos, this Greek word
Yeah.
meaning words, but actually it's a much more active notion than is captured by the modern use of the word. It means almost like tendency or allure or pull, and as well as creative unfolding and so on. It's a performative word, if you like. And so I think that the imagination, as we know it, we all have a sense of the imagination. And no one doesn't have imagination. Even Urizen in his most narrow moments, it's still full of imagination. It's just got very narrowed and focused. And so hence, you might even call it satanic in the way that we were just referring to. And I find that quite encouraging. It's not like imagination's left us, and you only have to look around the wider culture to see that. The entertainment industry and so on. Imagination clearly is active. But the question is, how does it understand itself? What's it relating to? Is it taking us out of ourselves or turning us in on ourselves and so on? So a lot flows from this idea that the imagination has us rather than you or I perhaps having something called imagination.
Yes, and I love that. I'd like to explore this a bit earlier because it will lead. My second question, which I'm just putting to one side for the moment, is about the nature of the divine, because obviously I've spent a lifetime struggling with that one. Another easy word to throw out. But this notion of the I love that notion of the imagination has us rather than we have the imagination. Where I'd like to question you a little bit is in terms of, okay, where does imagination come from then? And this, I think, where some of the comments that we've traded is probably us operating, passing closely but slightly overlapping or at tangents to each other. So where does imagination come from?
But it comes from the source, the wellspring, from the divine, from God. I think that Blake's use of the word emanation is quite helpful here. That it's in the nature of the divine to be abundant. And again, slightly in parentheses, I think this is a way in which Blake can really help us, because even when things are dark, the sense of abundance is always present in Blake. It's a kind of confused abundance, as opposed to, say, a scarcity. And I think that the sense that life is scarce, it's fragile, we've got to hold on to it, possess it, control it, and so on. And that's another big difference, with scarcity feeling very dominant in our culture now rather than abundance. So I think it comes from the sense of the divine. In the divine very nature is to overflow, is to generous, is to outpour, and so, but creatively, an infinite life can show up in myriad finite ways, and each finite way is some sort of reflection or echo of that infinite life. And I think that quite standard, actually, understanding of classical theism, which I think Blake knew quite a lot about, actually.
Yes, he did.
I think that he uses that, and then, inevitably and wonderfully, he uses different words, although he can quote, I think, church fathers. The famous remark he makes it in the pamphlet, "There's no natural religion, therefore God becomes as we are, that we might be as God is just sort of standard church father, actually. But nonetheless, it comes from God. That would be the short answer.
And this, I think, is actually, sorry, we're going to go there. So this notion of then the divine coming from God. So actually, rather than jumping in, which is of course a
I know
terrible
it's
tendency.
complicated.
No, I know. So the reason why I asked this question because this is a kind of gets to a heart, I think, where you and I pass over, cross over different pathways. And interesting that there is no natural religion, all religions are one, which I think are two astonishing texts. They are just, as part of the Enlightenment, literally in that tradition, running. You mentioned the patristic fathers, etc., but also, although there's no evidence that Blake knew or read Spinoza, but it actually goes in that sort of Enlightenment tradition of kind of first principles of building up. One of the things I find quite, uh, God becomes as we, so we can become as God. But also that notion that we are also then. So for me, we are creating that God because the theism I find really interesting. And when I was writing Divine Images, there's certain comments that Blake writes which seem to be on the surface atheistic, but Blake is clearly a theist. He clearly has this fundamental belief in God. One of the things I find really interesting, you do bring up in the book as well, is how absolute clear, how precise Blake is sometimes in terms of his rejection of deism. And actually, before talking about the nature of the divine, could you say a little bit, because this is an opportunity to talk to somebody about deism, which I almost never have in my daily life, because most people just go, what? But it's actually been an abiding obsession of mine over the past 30 years since I first started working on Blake. So you make some very pertinent points about deism, which I'd like to discuss. So first of all, for our listeners, what do you mean by what's meant by deism, and how did Blake engage with it?
Yeah, look, thanks. And I mean, I think of deism as the probably dominant understanding we've got, the dominant theology in Blake's time that actually was held by establishment figures like the King and revolutionaries like Thomas Paine alike. But it's and it really it comes from the astonishing work of Isaac Newton, I think. Newton and then Locke, two other Blake's, favorite figures, I say. I think their presence, I understand from the history now, in the 18th century, really can't be, underestimated. But again, the brilliant imaginative realization of Newton that the same force that caused an apple to fall is that which causes the moon to spin around the Earth. That is not intuitively obvious, and yet he had the imaginative capacity to realize that and then make it sort of tractable in mathematical form. But I think that sense that there's a universal law there, so maybe there's universal laws in all sorts of places. And so figures like John Locke, who said he was an underlaborer of Newton, try and seek out the universal laws in the mind, say, or seek out the universal laws when it comes to governance. And this is a huge part of what you might call the modern project. So that then leads to this idea that God is a sort of lawgiver, a designer, if you like, a demiurge, and that's at the heart of deism. But Blake spots that what that leads to, though, is a sort of withdrawal of the sense of the divine presence, because what matters is how the laws are operative, not how a living relationship with a deity is present. And so deism, starts to shape the theological imagination in his time. The Nobo Daddy is, another of Blake's famous phrases about this, disappearing into the clouds. And then I think that what happens is quite soon after Blake dies, actually, in the mid-19th century, that starts to form into Victorian atheism. Because if God's withdrawn, having set the laws, well, you've got the laws, why do you need God? And so God sort of just disappears from the imagination, and then you get, famous physicists making remarks, I have no need of that hypothesis, i.e. the hypothesis of God. So deism is again the precursor to the sort of atheistic assumption of our time. But Blake tells you what's happened there, that it's because we've assumed that the world is shaped lawfully, which clearly it is in certain respects. It's a good, at least first pass, and can get you to the moon, for example, in many ways. But clearly, to my mind anyway, it's like at best the first approximation in certain contexts, and even in physics, of course, now with Einstein adding his big gloss to Newtonian mechanics, physicists. And I think even actually Einstein did say that physics was kind of held up for a couple of centuries because it was too in awe of the Newtonian success.
Yes.
So, Blake's kind of in there somewhere, even by his rejection of deism, to come back to your question. He
Yeah.
sees that deism will kill us, basically, which is why he's so strong. It would, I mean, nowadays that it's language that has maybe more powerful a resonance and, an unfortunate resonance. But he does say the deists are enemies of the human race. And I think what he means, though, is because it will uncouple us from the living spirit within us.
Which comes up one of the reasons why I ask about deism, and also your background as a physicist. The incredible. I remember the first time I read Principia Mathematica because of Blake. Sort of engaging with Newton, and struggling. I've got a background in some science and technology, but struggling. I'll be honest. And then you get to this final section on Pantocrator, and it's sort of like, what? What? You're reading this book on physics, which suddenly at the end turns into a thesis on theology.
It's the
I
same
mean,
in the optics as well. At the end of the optics, there's these kind of like remaining questions, and they're theological questions as much
yes.
as anything else. But
Sorry.
maybe that strangely, the spirit that's in the physics is also in the esoterica, because
Yeah.
both, in a way, I think Blake would call generalizations.
Yes.
And there's always a danger for all their power of going into a world that you've made for yourself through generalizations, and that's, I think, the heart of his critique of science. That when science delivers a power called technology to then build a world technologically, which of course we do in increasing measure now, you're living in a generalized sense of reality rather than being in touch with the minute particulars itself. So that's another great risk of the deistic spirit, that it uncouples us in that way too.
The notion. I mean, I think one of the errors which deism creates very forcefully, which Blake is then able to respond to so clearly, is the notion that there is a God out there. There's a God, or in a sense, taking some notions from sort of Aquinas's cosmological arguments. It's the almost the Big Bang that brings everything into existence. That's the proof of God. There is this external deity that exists to us, and that's where I actually have profound questions about how Blake deals with the divine. I'm not convinced at all that he believes in any form of external divine. Um, Interesting, when I was reading your book, I found a route into this when you talk about the expansion of perceptions. Because for me, I mean, the notion of a self-contained individual ego locked in their body, looking through the windows, the chinks of the soul in this age through their eyes, their mouth, our nostrils, our ears, etc. This actually, Blake wants to extend our sight. When you look over the horizon, you are there over the horizon. When you hear the sound of the sky, the birds in the sky, you are there as part of that world, etc. Where does the imagination come from?
Well, it's God, but no, but this is now the more interesting discussion, because
Yes.
I mean, actually, I think it's even in the spirit of what you were saying there, that Blake's saying that when you intuit over the horizon, you're there over the horizon. So I think partly in a theological mode, what that would be saying is that the transcendent divine is also immanent, that, as it were, at the heart of us is infinity as well as the infinite divine around us. And I think that again, just to loop back to was it orthodox or not? I think that in Aquinas, and certainly in the mystical writings that he was deeply influenced by, figures like Teresa of Avila and so on, that this is what it means to be a mystic, is that to know that which is prior to you, in an ontological sense at least, is also you in a way, is also part of you at least. And the when Blake says, annihilate the selfhood in me, another part of that is to go to what figures like Teresa of Avila and Meister Eckhart would call the nothingness
Yeah.
within us, that actually is the divine presence within us as well. So there's this move towards disidentifying, to use a bit of a modern psychobabble word, with that which we think is ourselves, to discover that which is the heart of ourselves. And so this sense of God being certainly sort of bigger than us, if you like, but that traditionally understood is also the source that's within us. And just also to say, I mean, another thought I had, that's all rather high theology, but uh,
You believe me, you're talking to an audience that
right,
loves
right, yeah.
that.
The other much more practical realization that I remember having is, I work as a psychotherapist. I used to work in a psychiatric hospital, and this is one thing that convinced me that the imagination has us rather than we having the imagination. Because if you work with people, who are very ill, suffering seriously, but they're trapped by their imagination. And moreover, although it can be rather alarming even at first when you meet them, it gets a bit tedious after a while because it's just on a loop. And it might be quite an elaborately formed world, but it's a world that's closed in on itself. And that made me realize that we human beings of our own volition, which in a way, and you might say that people who are suffering in that way have got stuck in their own volition. It's not, they can't escape from it by their will, obviously, but something's happened that's caused them to turn in on themselves. We couldn't imagine the wider world. We couldn't do all the work that modern theories of perception would have the brain do. It just doesn't work like that. And so, the widely perceiving mind is actually free, and it's free. Its freedom is to receive from the external imagination, which is also that which is the cause of the imagination that we have. So it was there's the high theology bit, but there's also the quite practical sense that I had that, if it were true what a lot of neuroscientists tell us, that we imagine the world, as sense data, as it were, hits the tabula rasa. I know it's moved on a bit from Locke's formulation, but that's still the broadly dominant paradigm, actually. Um, Somehow this consciousness extrudes from the brain. Even the brain, it's just not powerful enough. And you see that in people who have got stuck in their own heads. And you realize that the worlds are very small. They don't have this expansive, extensive quality. There's both the high theology bit about, the transcendent being within us, immanent, as well as around us, so on. But
I
but
mean,
quite it's part of my life experience, if you like, working with people.
our imagination, so our role in creating the imagination is just as important as the world creating us. And the example, actually, the fundamental example for me, which I'd mentioned before we started the podcast, is poetry. For me, Blake starts actually not as a religious figure, but as a poet, a maker. And that's what poetry fundamentally is. It's the making, visually, artistically, verbally, through a whole host of activities. And of course, if you stick to language for a moment, for words, the words that we use clearly come from outside of us. We're learning them. But within that kind of internalization and those projections that we make, including ourselves. And actually, the example you just gave there was a very humane one in terms of, people who are suffering because they are locked in this collapsed world. Anybody's read Blake and that Euryzenic world, that world that loss creates in the book of Urizen, trapping everybody inside it. They can't escape. That's hell. And particularly you're saying your work as a psychotherapist, when you encounter that, when you see somebody suffering, we want to find ways to break this. And I suppose for me, the fundamental that Blake brought, which the modern world struggles with, is a sense of agency, of purpose, of drive, of energy. I mean, a good Blakean word, energy. For me, energy is always a source of imagination. And energy can't simply, and I was very pleased when you said that, sort of the transcendental is also the immanent. We have to have the energy to create that transcendental as well. It's always been a driving force of me. And that's what. So I realize very often when I was talking about this, for me, Jesus was not an orthodox. A lot of the orthodox Christianity has externalized Christ, stuck him up in heaven, placed him on a cloud. Obviously a very, very crude simplification there. And what Blake recognized was, I am Jesus. I am that divine source of, I can make gods, I can make the world, but also hopefully escape that trap of the collapsed universe, which is a false, hollow, very poor self, which we're expected to live with these days.
Yeah. And look, just to share the sense of I think the disaster it's been lived out in the decline of the church, certainly in the lands in which we live, that of doing precisely that. I just don't just I completely agree with you about what institutional religiosity has done, Christianity has done to figures like Jesus. I mean, I think another facet of this is Blake's, I think, deep rejection of moralizing and the
Yes.
wastes of moral law and so on. He completely saw that when Christianity becomes a moral creed, it's got massive moral implications, but when that's your starting point, then you're killing the spirit as well. It's another facet of deism. Um, but to the point about yeah, that's to me one of the reasons why Blake really matters actually, because he is a mystic who can help recover, I think, a proper sense of what Christianity is about, um, uh, because he understands that so much has gone wrong, and has a way of analyzing that, as well as in his poetry and imagery, re-injecting the energy. Which you need, like you say, but also just on this, the poet creator point reminded me of something, which is I think that um, our creativity absolutely matters, even if it's our not necessarily writing poetry, but the creativity we have to bring in order to receive the spirit of a poem. I mean, it's another one of the great troubles of our age is that we tend to think of knowledge and awareness and so on as if there's facts I've got that I can sort of pour into your head and you can pour some into my head. We lose the sense of comprehension and formation and revelation. It's a very active, and that's another important Blake point. This deistic notion leaves you passive in relation to the world, whereas to be active in relation to the world is absolutely fundamental. So our creativity is operative when we receive something from a poem, even if you just hear a couple of lines, like to see a world in a grain of sand, heaven in a world of flower. That is your creativity hearing that to receive it. So I think this is you're absolutely right about that, and that's why poetry is so potent in this kind of discussion and context in which we live. But that is also, I think, because the divine is within us, and so in some small way, we're reflecting the divine creativity. That is to be part of what it is to know the divine, to cooperate with this flow of imagination. And so, what to know the divine, you've got to in some way become conscious of the divine within you. And so your own creativity is what opens you up to the divine creativity that is a collaboration then. Yeah.
Um, Thank you very much for joining me today. It's absolutely wonderful. Actually, I hope that we can follow up with perhaps something a bit more guided on a specific element, actually.
I think having dialogues about this is part of this reaching from within ourselves to the wider world. And so, I wonder even whether the podcast form appeals to people now, because there is this sense of a kind of third thing that you get in the dialogue when it's good between two people. Um, there's another presence, as it were, and so I think that's very much that's quite a Blakean perception or understanding of what might be going on. There is a moment in each day that Satan can't find, or can his watchmen find it, but the industrious find this moment and it multiply and all that. So look, that's all to say. I'd be delighted to talk more.
Absolutely. So I'd like to thank Mark Vernon, whose book Awake, Blake and the Power of the Imagination is out in the UK and will shortly be published in the US as well. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Jason.